At the gates of Vienna, Europe trembled. A vast Ottoman army, the most feared power of its age, had surrounded the great city and threatened to break through its walls. Behind those defenses, starving citizens and weary soldiers wondered if this was the end of Christendom. But then, against all odds, a Polish king rode forth with a thunder of hooves that would shake the world and alter the course of history forever. By the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the most formidable powers on earth, its dominion stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of North Africa and far into the heart of Europe. Its armies were vast, disciplined, and seasoned by centuries of conquest. European kings watched nervously as Ottoman banners advanced ever westward, swallowing principalities and fortresses that had once seemed impregnable. Now the empire's ambitions focused on Vienna, the glittering capital of the Habsburgs and the key to the rich heartlands of Central Europe. Whoever held Vienna could open the gates to the continent itself. The coming siege was more than a campaign of soldiers and cannons. It was a collision of civilizations. To the Ottomans, victory promised a triumphant expansion of Islamic rule into the very core of Christian Europe. To the kingdoms of the West, defeat threatened not only political ruin, but the symbolic fall of Christendom. Faith, culture, and the delicate balance of power all hung on the fragile defenses of one beleaguered city. The fate of Europe would be decided not in council chambers, but on the muddy fields outside Vienna's walls. Sultan Mehmed placed his trust in his Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa, a man renowned for his cunning and relentless ambition. Leading a force approaching 150,000 soldiers, janissaries, cavalry, engineers, and artillery, Mustafa envisioned a swift and glorious conquest that would secure his name alongside the great conquerors of the past. His confidence was unshaken as the immense host marched through Hungary, a living tide of tents, banners, and glittering arms that few European armies could hope to match. For Kara Mustafa, Vienna was not merely a target. It was the jewel that would crown his career. By the summer of 1683, the Ottoman army reached Vienna and tightened its noose around the city. The defenders, fewer than 20,000 soldiers under Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, faced an enemy several times their number. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, and every day the boom of Ottoman cannon fire shook the walls and the hearts of those within. Yet even as starvation and despair set in, riders slipped through secret routes carrying pleas for help to the courts of Europe. Far beyond the smoke of the siege, a coalition was stirring, an alliance that would determine whether Vienna and Europe itself would endure or fall. When the Ottoman host tightened its ring around Vienna, it was more than an army that arrived. Kara Mustafa's forces moved like a living machine of war, tens of thousands of soldiers accompanied by engineers schooled in the dark arts of siegecraft. Under the cover of night, they carved tunnels beneath the city walls, packing them with black powder meant to tear open the ancient masonry in a single thunderous breath. Day after day the earth shook with the crash of heavy cannon, the echo of iron striking stone rolling across the Danube plain. Smoke hung in the air like a choking veil, while the defenders scrambled to shore up breaches and repel sorties, each frantic repair buying a few more hours of life, but draining the last reserves of strength. Inside the walls, Vienna became a crucible of endurance. Bread dwindled to thin rations measured by the ounce. Wells turned brackish, and fever crept through the narrow alleys where families huddled in damp cellars. Mothers whispered prayers as Ottoman war drums throbbed from the dark fields beyond the ramparts, their rhythm a reminder that death waited only yards away. Every citizen knew what capture meant. Tales of cities taken by the Sultan's armies, of executions, slavery, and fire, circulated in trembling voices, sharpening the defenders' resolve even as hunger hollowed their cheeks. Beyond the battered gates, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa exuded cold confidence. He believed the city's fall was inevitable, a matter of time rather than courage. Weeks of relentless bombardment, he reasoned, would erode stone and spirit alike, sparing his soldiers the cost of a direct assault. From his richly furnished pavilion, he watched the smoke rise from Vienna's walls and envisioned the triumph that would etch his name alongside the great conquerors of the empire. Yet his self-assurance blinded him to the gathering storm on the horizon, a coalition of Christian states slowly stitching their banners together and preparing to march. At the heart of that coalition rode a figure whose arrival would alter the course of Europe. King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, veteran of countless campaigns, rallied his famed winged hussars and summoned the Allies to the cause. His march across rugged terrain became a beacon of hope whispered through Vienna's beleaguered streets. To the starving defenders, he was still a distant name, but soon the thunder of his cavalry would break the silence of despair and turn the siege into legend. As the siege dragged on, Vienna's plight deepened. Emperor Leopold I had already fled before the Ottoman advance, leaving Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg to shoulder the defense. Brave and stubborn, Starhemberg patched walls and rallied men. Yet he knew the city could not endure forever. Couriers slipped through hidden routes at night, carrying desperate appeals to the courts of Europe, but many rulers hesitated. Some feared the mighty Ottoman army. Others weighed the risk and saw no reason to sacrifice their soldiers for a distant city's fate. Still, the threat could not be ignored. Should Vienna fall, the road into the heart of Europe would stand open, placing Bavaria, Saxony, and perhaps even the Rhine within Ottoman reach. Recognizing both the spiritual and political peril, Pope Innocent XI stepped forward. From Rome, he called for a holy league to unite Christian princes. Old rivalries and jealousies flared, but fear of a common enemy began to outweigh suspicion. Among those who answered, none carried more weight than Jan III Sobieski of Poland. A seasoned warrior and master strategist, Sobieski understood that Vienna's loss would soon bring Ottoman armies to Poland's own frontiers. Duty to Christendom and duty to his homeland became one and the same. Without delay, he pledged his famed cavalry, the winged hussars, and began the long march south, a decision that would tilt the balance of Europe. Inside Vienna, word of Sobieski's advance spread like a spark in dry grass. Soldiers and citizens clung to the rumor of approaching allies even as hunger and bombardment wore them down. Outside the walls, Kara Mustafa tightened his grip, convinced the city was already his, unaware that salvation was threading its way through mountain passes toward the Danube. Jan III Sobieski was no ordinary monarch. Before he was crowned King of Poland, he had already earned fame as a warrior, fighting against Tatars, Cossacks, and Ottomans. His rise to power was built on both military brilliance and personal courage, for he was a man who led from the front, not from the safety of a distant palace. His enemies feared him, but his soldiers adored him. They knew that wherever Sobieski rode, victory often followed. At the heart of Sobieski's army were the famed winged hussars. These elite cavalrymen, clad in shining armor and adorned with great wooden wings, were a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Their charge was like a thunderstorm, breaking enemy lines with unstoppable force. No other army in Europe possessed such a weapon, and Sobieski intended to use them at Vienna to devastating effect. As he marched through the rugged Carpathian Mountains, Sobieski gathered allies along the way. German princes, Bavarian troops, and other contingents joined under his command, forming a coalition force of about 70,000 men. It was a rare moment of unity among Christian powers, all brought together by the looming threat of Ottoman conquest. Sobieski, chosen as the supreme commander, bore the weight of both hope and responsibility. When news reached Vienna that Sobieski was approaching, the city erupted in cautious celebration. For months, the defenders had lived in darkness and despair, but now a glimmer of light pierced the gloom. Still, no one could yet imagine the scale of the battle to come, or how Sobieski's arrival would change the course of history in a single, thunderous day. By late summer of 1683, Vienna stood on the edge of collapse. Kara Mustafa's vast army, numbering perhaps 150,000, encircled the city, their banners and tents stretching as far as the eye could see. Day after day, the Ottomans bombarded the walls with cannons, digging tunnels beneath the defenses in hopes of collapsing the fortifications. Within the city, food grew scarce, disease spread, and the exhausted defenders wondered how much longer they could endure. The Ottomans pressed their advantage with relentless determination. Siege towers loomed over the walls, while miners packed explosives beneath the bastions. On several occasions, sections of the city's defenses nearly gave way, saved only by desperate counterattacks from Vienna's garrison. Yet for every assault repelled, the sense of doom grew heavier. Time, it seemed, favored Kara Mustafa. Inside Vienna, Count Starhemberg showed unshakable resolve. Despite illness and wounds, he inspired his men to fight on, knowing that surrender meant massacre. His letters, smuggled through enemy lines, spoke of dire circumstances but carried one steady message: help must come soon, or Vienna would fall. The defenders clung to that hope as their only lifeline. Outside the walls, Kara Mustafa grew overconfident. Believing victory certain, he delayed launching a full-scale storming of the city, preferring to starve Vienna into submission and claim its capture with minimal losses. This hesitation, born of arrogance and ambition, would prove to be his undoing. For while he tightened the noose, Sobieski's army was already closing in from the hills. On the night of September 11th, 1683, Sobieski's coalition army took position along the wooded hills above Vienna. From the ridgelines they gazed down upon a plain alive with firelight, the Ottoman camp sprawling for miles like a restless sea of embers. The faint roar of thousands of soldiers, the clang of hammers repairing weapons, and the distant calls of muezzins carried up through the cool night air. Scouts returned with final reports, priests offered blessings, and commanders traced lines in the dirt, knowing that at sunrise the fate of Vienna, and perhaps the balance of Europe itself, would be decided. With the first blush of dawn, the Christian armies surged forward. German and Austrian infantry struck the Ottoman left flank, muskets cracking and cannon smoke rolling across the fields. Earth shuddered under the pounding of artillery as pikemen and janissaries met in brutal hand-to-hand struggle. The Ottomans, though still formidable in number, reeled at the sudden ferocity of the attack. Trenches and earthworks changed hands again and again as the defenders of Vienna, watching from the walls, cheered each hard-won advance. Amid the chaos, King Jan III Sobieski held his greatest weapon in check. The Polish winged hussars, armored riders whose great feathered frames shimmered in the morning sun, waited like a coiled storm behind the hills. Sobieski rode their lines, speaking calm words, eyes fixed on the battlefield below. He knew that a premature charge could squander their might, but the right moment could shatter an empire. For hours the infantry ground forward, fields already slick with blood, while the cavalry's restrained presence loomed like a promise of thunder. Below, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa struggled to impose order on a battlefield unraveling beneath him. His vast host stretched across the plain, but attacks now came from several directions at once, sowing confusion among janissaries and cavalry alike. Messengers galloped through choking smoke with contradictory orders. Drums beat frantic signals that few could follow. Though Ottoman soldiers fought with desperate courage, their commanders' control began to slip, and the great army's strength slowly turned to chaos, just as Sobieski had hoped. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to slip toward the western hills, King Jan III Sobieski finally raised his arm and gave the signal that would resound through history. From the wooded heights above Vienna, 18,000 cavalrymen began to move, the earth trembling beneath their hoofs. At the very front rode the Polish winged hussars, their long lances catching the fading light, the great wooden wings on their backs rattling in the wind like the first growl of distant thunder. To the Ottoman soldiers scattered across the plain, the descending mass looked less like men and horses than an onrushing tide of iron and fury. The charge gathered speed until it struck with a force that seemed almost supernatural. The Ottoman lines, worn thin by a day of relentless fighting, buckled and then split apart as the avalanche of cavalry crashed into them. Horses smashed through barricades, lances splintered against shields, and the air filled with the roar of battle and the screams of men swept under the wave. Panic rippled outward as Christian riders carved deep wedges into the enemy formations, cutting toward the very heart of the Ottoman command. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa's proud army unraveled in a matter of moments. What had begun as a siege of confident calculation now turned into a stampede of fear. Soldiers threw down weapons and fled in every direction, abandoning cannon, banners, and the carefully ordered camp that had once promised victory. Smoke and dust rose in choking clouds as tents burned and wagons overturned, marking the death of an empire's ambition. The dream of carrying the crescent deeper into Europe ended in a single, devastating stroke. On the city walls, the starving defenders who had endured weeks of bombardment erupted in cries of relief and disbelief. Bells pealed across Vienna, their sound carrying over the shattered battlefield as citizens rushed to the ramparts to witness their deliverance. Below them, Sobieski and his winged hussars pressed the fleeing enemy until the plain itself seemed to echo with their victory. Vienna was saved, and with it the fragile balance of Christendom, secured by one thunderous charge that changed the course of European history. When the smoke of battle finally lifted, the full scale of the triumph came into view. Across the plain lay the wreckage of the Ottoman host, abandoned cannons, overturned wagons, and the bodies of tens of thousands of soldiers who had once marched with unshakable confidence. Vienna itself stood scarred but unbroken, its walls cracked and blackened, yet still defiant. For Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, the disaster was beyond repair. He had promised the Sultan a glorious conquest, only to return in shame. Within weeks, the man who had dreamed of carrying the crescent into Europe was executed by his own empire, a silken cord sealing his downfall. For Europe, the relief was immediate and profound. The Battle of Vienna marked a decisive turning point in the centuries-long struggle between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe. No longer would Ottoman armies threaten to surge deep into the continent's heart. From this day forward, their power began a slow but relentless retreat, while the states of Central and Eastern Europe, Austria, Poland, and their allies, found new confidence to shape the balance of power. The defeat at Vienna signaled not just the end of a siege, but the beginning of an era in which the Ottoman advance was permanently checked. For King Jan III Sobieski, the victory became the crowning achievement of a lifetime of warfare. His daring march and the thunderous charge of his winged hussars entered legend almost overnight, celebrated in royal courts and village squares alike. Painters captured the gleam of the hussars' armor, poets sang of their fearless descent, and chroniclers hailed Sobieski as the savior of Vienna and defender of Christendom. The battle was more than a military triumph. It was a moment when a single leader's courage and calculation preserved the fragile order of an entire civilization. The story of Vienna endures because it speaks to more than armies and empires. It is a reminder that history often turns on acts of unity and resolve, when ordinary men and women stand firm against overwhelming odds. Centuries later, the bells of Vienna still seem to ring across time, carrying the memory of a night when Europe's fate balanced on a knife's edge. And here on Aftertime, we continue to share these moments where history refuses to stay silent. If you enjoyed this story, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because countless more battles, mysteries, and legends await discovery.